So far for this Vegas trip, we've had one big win at the Wynn, followed by one small loss at Horseshoe. I'm currently up about $700 on the trip. Let's see if we can make that even more on day 3. What's up guys? Super quick intro today. Let me turn off the fan real quick. We're going to be playing at the Wynn, nothing special today. Horseshoe was an okay poker room, but just not enough action for me. And we do want to play some 5-5 or 2-5, and I just like the Wynn better. So I'm going to get lunch real quick, and then we will start the poker. I get a seat at the must move immediately. We're in for 1500 and I pick up pocket aces in the first hand of the session. We're 6-handed and I'm in under the gun. I open to 20 and I get called by the hijack and the button. 3 ways to a flop of 9, jack, 10. This is the worst possible flop for my hand. I check it over to my opponents and the hijack puts out a bet of 30. The player in the button calls and I decided to call as well for this price, but I actually think you could argue for a fold with aces on this flop multi-way. It's very unlikely that any run out will make me feel comfortable about my hand, and good players could easily just put pressure on me since they can easily have monster hands, whereas it's less likely I'm going to have those. Either way, we're 3 ways to a turn card, which is the deuce of clubs. The blankest card possible. It completes the rainbow and it shouldn't have changed anything. I check to my opponents once again. The hijack continues betting, this time only betting 60 into 155. The player on the button folds, and because the bet was so small and we're now heads up, I think calling here is completely fine as played because my opponent could easily have something like king jack, queen jack, and I don't think my opponent's going to have a super strong hand with this small sizing. If he had something like 2 pair or better, he should be betting big to get value from worse hands. The river comes down the king of hearts. Terrible card here. Now we've got aces on a board where any queen makes a straight. I'm just going to check and fold to any bet. My opponent checks back, but it's still very likely we're beat, and he ends up showing pocket tens. He flopped the set on a very wet board. I'm kind of surprised he didn't bet bigger on the turn. It was a terrible run out for him, and he could have taken the pot down earlier, but he beats our aces anyways. Shortly afterwards, I get moved to a new table. The player in early position is a younger guy with a really big stack. He opens to 15. The player in the low jack flats, and I look down at king queen offsuit in the hijack. I don't want to just call and be dominated by the early position player's range, so we're going to squeeze with this one, hoping for a fold. I make it $65, and the player in early position makes the call. So does the player in the low jack. We're going to a flop 3 ways once again. It comes down 10-10-4 with 2 clubs. I've got 2 overcards and some backdoor straight opportunities. Both of my opponents check to me. We're going to bet small on a board like this. I make it $60. Only the player in early position calls. The turn card brings an offsuit 10. There are now 3 10s on the board and my opponent checks to me once again. I decided to check back, and I can only imagine my reasoning was something like, maybe my opponent had like 8s or 9s and I didn't think he would fold with those hands. But looking back, I think this is absolutely supposed to be a bet here. Given the way I played, I could easily have aces, kings, queens, maybe jacks. This is very similar to a hand in the last vlog where I actually did have aces on a board that was 6-6, queen 6, and I should have been betting more for value in that hand. This time I should be betting as a bluff since I can rep really strong full houses, whereas my opponent can't really have those. The best hands he could have here are maybe pocket 9s and maybe some random 10, but quads are extremely unlikely. So I definitely should be continuing here, possibly for a bigger sizing, maybe even an overbet. On top of this, me having a queen makes it less likely he has pocket queens, which he could reasonably play this way. And because I don't have clubs, it's very likely my opponent could simply be on a club draw here. I don't like my play in hindsight, but we're going to a river and it comes down a club. I don't remember the exact card, but it's maybe something like a 7. It doesn't really matter because my opponent checks, and given that I checked the turn, I didn't feel like I could reasonably rep something strong here, so I just decided to check back and give up. We've got king high, and my opponent shows pocket 4s. He flopped the boat. Unfortunately for him, the turn made one of his 4s irrelevant, and yeah, it was just another bad run out for my opponent, but it's on me for missing an opportunity to play aggressively and potentially take down the hand. I'm already down about $300 and it's still really early in the session. I've got pocket nines in the hijack for this next one. I open it to $20 and only get called by the player in the big blind. He was also at the must move, and from the limited information I had, he seemed aggressive and also potentially seemed loose. The flop comes down Jack King 7 with 2 spades. The big blind checks, and I decide to check back since we've got some showdown value and we need to have some strong hands in our checking range. The turn comes down the 7 of hearts pairing the board. My opponent checks once again, and given that he didn't bet the turn once I checked back the flop, I don't put him on a strong hand, and I feel like I could potentially take it down with a small bet. I could very well be ahead, but there are a lot of cards that can come that I won't be happy about, and we don't really know where we're at. I decide to bet 15 here with the intention of taking it down early, kind of for protection, and my opponent pretty quickly raises to $50. As I've said a couple vlogs ago, quick raises, especially when the line doesn't really make sense, tend to indicate that my opponent's bluffing. If my opponent actually had a very strong hand that he's trying to rep here with a check raise, he should just be betting that right away on the turn. I can't imagine anything he could realistically have. Another thing you have to consider when you're trying to bluff catch with a weak hand, maybe like nines in this case, is whether your opponent's bluffs can actually be beating you, but I don't think my opponent's ever doing this with like Jack X or anything. So I ultimately decide I'm going to make the call here and reevaluate on the river. It comes down the 5 of diamonds, blank as it gets. I think I'm still good, and the big blind checks it over to me. We know our hand's good here. It's one of those situations where I could honestly just bet to not have to show my hand, but I take the safe option and just check back, knowing that my opponent's bluffing. He shakes his head, says queen high, and once I show my hand, we end up scooping the pot. So nice little bluff catch here. It's similar to the one I mentioned where my opponent quickly raised me on a queen high flop when I had queen 9. I ended up calling him down and was also right that time, so sometimes you just gotta trust your gut. It seems we're only playing pocket pairs for this episode because I have pocket jacks for this next one in early position. I open to $20 and get called by the small blind this time. This player was also at the must move, and she recently lost in a massive cooler where she had deuces full of aces, I believe, against I think a bigger full house. She seemed pretty tilted. We're going to a flop of ace 9 8 with 2 diamonds. Not the best flop for pocket jacks here. Once the small blind checks to me, I decided to bet 15. Looking back, I don't like it. I probably just looked at the board, thought ace high favors my range, I'm going to bet small here, but in hindsight, I don't like this. I want to have a hand like jacks in my checking range. Having pocket jacks also makes it less likely my opponent has something like jack 10, which I want them to have. And finally, I have the jack of diamonds, which makes it less likely my opponent would have a flush draw. I get punished for it because the small blind quickly check raises to $45, and even given what I said about quick raises seeming weak, I just don't think this is a spot where I should be a hero. I can just let it go knowing that I block all the bluffs. If there's any hand I should be folding in the spot, it's exactly pocket jacks with the jack of diamonds. But against my better judgment from the future, I ended up thinking for a bit and flatting without really having a plan for future runouts. The turn comes the deuce of clubs, it's a blank, and my opponent now fires for 125, pretty much a pot-sized bet, and I just let it go here, knowing that I should have just folded on the flop and potentially not even bet. It's been about 3 hours at this point. I once again pick up pocket aces in early position, and I open to 20. The player in the low jack calls. He seemed like a solid player and had a large stack. The flop comes down 6 jack 8 with 2 spades. Our hand still looks pretty good here. I put out a bet of $20 and my opponent raises me to 75. We could likely still be ahead given that there are so many bluffs my opponent could have, so I decide to make the call. The turn is the 4 of diamonds, only 5-7 gets there, but this does put out another flush draw, so once I check to my opponent and he bets 125, I decide to make the call once again. The river comes down the 9 of diamonds. This completes the backdoor flush draw as well as hands like queen 10 or 10-7. And I check to my opponent again, ready to call any reasonably sized bet. He decides to bet 475 here, so just about pot. It's an annoying spot because he's basically telling me he's flopped a set, and I feel like he's strong, but at the same time, I am near the top of my range here. If I had something like jacks or eights, I probably would have played it more aggressively, maybe 3-betting on the flop or raising turn or something. And I ultimately decided that this opponent could potentially be making a move here. He could have something like 10-9 or 9-7, maybe just a spade draw, especially given that I don't have the ace of spades. So even though I felt like I was behind, I ultimately make the crying call. and my opponent ends up having pocket sixes. So he did flop a set, took us to Value Town here, and we lose a pretty big pot. I'm down a good amount and not running really well, but also not playing my best. I add on another 1k before picking up pocket queens, also in early position. I race to $20 and get 3 callers, but that's not it because action's now on the small blind, who 3-bets to $200 here. This is the same player I caught bluffing earlier. It's a pretty big raise, and I don't think he's really semi-bluffing here, but it feels kind of wrong to fold queens here, especially in position against this player. I suspect that the other 3 callers are probably just going to get out of the way given how big the raise was, so I did decide to call and everyone else folds. So we're heads up to a flop of 9 ace 8 with 2 hearts here. The small blind checks to me and I make a pretty big mistake here, actually 2. I bet 125 here, miscalculating the pot size, and I do this way more often than I should, but it was very unfortunate and I thought I was betting about half pot, but honestly 125 into 465 isn't terrible, except for the fact that I probably shouldn't be betting here, period. Betting here really doesn't serve much of a purpose, and I guess I was just trying to get him off a hand since I saw that he checked, which is a really bad reason. He looks at me for a while before eventually raising to 800. I'm hating myself now for betting, and we just have to let it go here. Definitely lit $125 on fire that I didn't need to. Could have just checked flop and gotten away later instead of overcomplicating it. This one is completely on me. I'm card dead for a long time before finally picking up ace 5 of spades and under the gun, one of the first hands that isn't a premium or a pocket pair. I open to 20 and get called by the small blind, who was the same player from the last hand. The flop comes down 4-9-4 with 2 spades. This is exactly what you're looking for when you play a hand like ace 5 suited. My opponent checks to me and I'm going to take it down a lot of the time, so I bet 15. He ends up calling and the turn comes the 9 of diamonds. I don't mind this card. We now have 2 pair with the ace kicker, so we're now chopping against any ace, and any non-boat hands or non-ace X hands aren't really going to feel super comfortable here. My opponent now decides to lead out for $50 into 75, and I know he's never doing this when he actually has a monster, and I just don't see him doing this with like 7s or 8s to protect his hand. So I honestly just put him on ace X as well, that doesn't really know what to do and wants to show some aggression and take the betting lead. So I'm pretty confident my hand's either good or chopping, and I make the call. The river is a blank of some sort. I forgot exactly what it was, but let's just say an offsuit 6. It doesn't really matter. My opponent bets $100 here, and I think for a bit, just trying to make sure he can't have any random monster. But after a while of thinking, I do make the call, and honestly, I think it's a very easy snap call. We're going to be chopping a lot of the time, and my opponent's probably never playing a stronger hand this way. He ends up showing ace 10 offsuit, so we do indeed chop here with 9s and 4s with the ace kicker. I thought about it and I was like, do I ever raise exploitatively on the river knowing that my opponent probably just has an ace? I don't know if I can ever really rep stronger hands, but maybe he doesn't know that, and I love folding people off of chops when I see the opportunity. In hindsight, I think his hand's pretty face up, but that's easy to say when I've seen the cards, so let me know what you guys think. And that's going to be the last hand for the vlog. I know it was just all pocket pairs and premiums, but sometimes that's just how sessions go. I was in for a total of $2,500. I played for exactly 7 hours and cashed out for $841 for a loss of $1,659. Pretty big loss. We were up about $700 for the trip before this session, and now we're down even more than that amount. If I want to end the Vegas trip with the win, I have a pretty big hole to climb out of in the next few days. Okay guys, as you saw, pretty brutal session. Lost, I think, $1,659. I think that was the number. That's what the fan sounds like when I forget to turn it off. Did not play perfect. I definitely could have done a lot better in a lot of hands. But regardless of how I played, there was no way I was going to avoid a loss today. So we're just going to have to take the L. I was up around 700 or so after yesterday for the trip, and now I'm down a little more than that. So it's going to be a tough trip. Tomorrow is the last day I have to play poker. I'm spending the next 3 nights in Vegas, just doing Vegas stuff because my friend's coming in. Yeah, if I don't make a big win tomorrow, this will be my first losing Vegas trip as a whole. So just gonna have to get lucky tomorrow, I guess. Alright guys, not much else to say. Pretty brutal session, but we'll get them next time, hopefully, because if I don't, then this is going to be a losing Vegas trip, and I haven't had a losing Vegas trip yet, so fingers crossed that we make a lot of money tomorrow and have an over $800 winning session so that we can at least break even / be positive, just so that we could, you know, technically be winning. Thank you guys for watching. Hope you enjoyed the hands. I know it was just like all premiums and stuff, but that really was how the session went. Whenever I had other types of playable hands, it was just bet flop fold or me getting bet off the flop or something like that. It was just very simple. I could not get anything going. I think we still had some interesting spots today, some fun decisions. Not so fun when I'm actually losing, but I think looking back it'll be good content. And I'll see you guys in the next vlog. Peace.